So I've been meaning to cover Mr. Big and Carrie's relationship from Sex and the City because it truly exemplifies the glorification of the anxious avoidant relationship dynamic in films and TV shows. Now, is this specific dynamic frequently depicted in Hollywood because it sells, or is it because it is a true reflection of human behavior within the context of romantic relationships? Do the viewers find it entertaining because it's a complete disaster, or because it is relatable? After all, various studies show that 1 in 4 people display avoidant or anxious attachment behaviors. So I decided to use Mr. Big and Carrie's relationship as a case study to explore the 2 types of attachment styles that tend to attract each other like magnets. Carrie Bradshaw and Mr. Big had a volatile and dysfunctional relationship, and I thought it would be interesting to analyze their dynamic so we'd gain a deeper understanding on the role attachment styles play in our romantic lives. The first thing I noticed about Mr. Big and Carrie's dynamic was that Carrie found him to be the prize and believed that he was a catch. It was all in her body language in their first encounters. It was in the way she looked at him and appeared to be flustered every time he was near her. I did not get the same impression from Mr. Big, as he was playing a little hard to get, making condescending jokes, coming off as aloof, and overall taking forever to commit to her. So you could already sense upon their first encounters that the power relied in Mr. Big's hands.
And so another Friday night in Manhattan crept towards dawn. Taxi! And just when I thought I would have to do the unspeakable, walk home,
well, get in, for Christ's sakes. Where can I drop you?
72nd Street, 3rd Avenue.
You got that, Al?
Yes, sir.
So what have you been doing lately?
You mean besides going out every night?
Yeah, I mean, what do you do for work?
Well, this is my work. I'm sort of a sexual anthropologist.
You mean like a hooker?
No. I write a column called Sex and the City. Right now I'm researching an article about women who have sex like men. You know, they have sex, and then afterwards they feel nothing.
But you're not like that.
Well, aren't you?
Not a drop. Not even half a drop.
Wow. What's wrong with you?
I get it. You've never been in love.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Suddenly, I felt the wind knocked out of me. I wanted to crawl under the covers and go right to sleep. I was beginning to float away on a sea of sweet potato puffs with smoked salmon and sour cream when it was Mr. Big, major tycoon, major dreamboat, and majorly out of my league.
I thought I saw you on the runway.
Oh, hi.
I started reading your column after we met.
So as we can see from these 2 clips, there was sexual and physical attraction between the 2. It was electric and it was very obvious. But the real question is, was it electric because it was based on true compatibility, or was it electric because it was their respective attachment styles interacting with each other? Personally, I don't believe that Mr. Big and Carrie were very compatible. I think that they were very drawn to each other based on physical attraction, but mostly because they triggered each other's attachment system. This brings us to the meat and potatoes of this case study. I am going to dive into what happens when an anxiously attached person meets an avoidant dismissive individual within the romantic context. Usually when these 2 meet, they tend to be drawn to each other like a moth to a flame. Something about the other person seems intense, enticing, and familiar. The key word here is familiar because they recognize these feelings and sensations when they meet one another. They might not remember from where, but it was embedded in their psyche early on in life. There is a sense of comfort in that. I am going to dive briefly into the concept of internal working models, which is a concept developed by the psychologist John Bowlby. So internal working models are cognitive frameworks or mental representations that shape how we perceive ourselves, others, and relationships. These models are developed early in life through interactive experiences with caregivers or attachment figures, and they are based on whether the caregiver meets the child's emotional needs in a consistent and adequate manner. So these internal working models influence how a person will behave and react in relationships throughout their life, particularly in terms of trust, intimacy, and emotional closeness. According to the attachment theory developed by psychologist John Bowlby and later expanded by the psychologist Mary Ainsworth, when the child's needs are met in a consistent, responsive, and sensitive manner, the child tends to develop a positive view of the self and a positive view of others, thus developing a strong sense of trust and security in their relationships later on. However, when the child's needs are met in an inconsistent, unpredictable, and emotionally unresponsive manner, then the child goes on to become insecurely attached and develops a negative view of themselves and an ambivalent view of others. That is precisely how the anxiety, hyper-preoccupation with relationships, and trust issues come about, because the child feels like they can't rely on their primary caregiver or attachment figure. That naturally makes them prone to developing hypervigilance in their interpersonal relationships, constantly seeking reassurance and validation. Carrie Bradshaw falls into this specific category, and I will further elaborate later. And when the child's needs are met in a neglectful, cold, and rejecting manner, the child is forced to learn how to become self-sufficient, emotionally closed off, and hyper-independent as a survival mechanism. And the child develops a negative view of others. As a result, intimacy and commitment issues appear later on because emotional suppression and emotional distance become the name of the game. So Mr. Big falls into this specific category. So in a nutshell, when an anxious meets an avoidant, there tends to be this push and pull dynamic that exists. And the anxiously attached is the one doing the pulling, and the dismissive avoidant is the one doing the pushing away. So to further make this clear, all you have to remember is that the core belief of the anxiously attached is, I need others to be okay. And the core belief of the dismissive avoidant is, I am better off on my own. Now, what do we know about Carrie's family life that explains her anxious attachment style? So we know that Carrie had a strained relationship with both of her parents. In Season 6, Episode 7, Carrie briefly mentions how her mother's absence left her with emotional scars. And we know that her father abandoned both her and her mother, so he wasn't involved in her life that much, if not at all. And it was said in the show that her parents had a divorce when she was very young. So Carrie is a child of divorced parents who weren't really there for her since a very young age, and that's grounds for attachment issues. And we understand now why Carrie's romantic experiences in adulthood were filled with themes of emotional neediness, fear of abandonment, and ambivalence. We do not know much about Mr. Big's family life or early life, but we know that his father was emotionally distant and emotionally unavailable. In episode 6 from season 4, Mr. Big briefly mentions his father when talking about his inability to express emotions or engage in vulnerability. But even without knowing that specific information, I think it's safe to say that Mr. Big's multiple divorces, his aversion to having children, and emotional intimacy issues were all telltale signs that he had strong avoidance tendencies. So how did that translate into adult Carrie and adult Mr. Big in a relationship? Carrie spent most of her time trying to make him own up to his feelings for her. She yelled, she cried, she begged, and she even walked away multiple times, trying to make him commit or declare his love to her. Now, many of the viewers watching the show must have gotten tired of Carrie's protest behaviors and pick-me antics, and they must have asked themselves why she would ever put up with such emotional torture. Why was she chasing a man who seemed to push her away? So it is important to note that the early relational experiences of children serve as a template or blueprint in their emotional lives. And even if those relational experiences were negative, they tend to be sought out in adulthood because that is what's familiar and predictable to the individual. It all goes back to having that sense of control and going for what we know. So if you were wondering, that is exactly why the Carries of the world put up with the Mr. Bigs of the world. So people would call Carrie's issues daddy issues, and they were not entirely wrong given the list of problematic and damaged men she's dated in the show. But it's overall attachment issues that she's dealing with, and that stems from the strained relationship with both her mother and father, also known as her primary attachment figures. Viewers must have also asked themselves, what was Mr. Big's problem? Why was he being so difficult? Why was he still pursuing or connecting with Carrie while putting that much effort into pushing her away and asserting his independence? And it is because Mr. Big was actually just as toxic and damaged as Carrie was. See, the problem with avoidant individuals is that they're in need of love just as much as the anxiously attached individuals are. But the only difference is that they spend a great deal of energy trying to conceal that. So Carrie fussing over him, throwing tantrums, and constantly seeking reassurance fed Mr. Big's ego tremendously. That level of attention and dependence is ironically soothing to the dismissive avoidant, but because they're not used to it and they have worked so hard to distance themselves from heavy emotions, they eventually always revert back to their avoidant tendencies. So this confusing internal conflict is what makes romantic relationships with avoidance insufferable and draining, because there is this constant push and pull dynamic. So in true anxious avoidant dynamic fashion, Mr. Big would be emotionally closed off with Carrie, and she would feel triggered, she would throw a fit, then they'd have an explosive fight, and then they would reconciliate shortly after without having solved the issue. I recall Carrie calling their pull toward one another an addiction, and that spoke volume. Their dysfunctional pattern went on for years until Carrie decided to finally give up and try to create a life with Alexander Petrovsky. I believe it was the Russian artist who made her move to Paris. So before leaving for Paris, Mr. Big decided to confront his deep feelings for Carrie, and he showed up at her doorstep, trying to get her back. And that is when Carrie absolutely lost it. As a viewer and psychology connoisseur, I knew that she had hit a breaking point and was mentally and emotionally exhausted by this little anxious avoidant dance that her and Mr. Big have been doing for years. It's interesting to see how Mr. Big showed up in that way only when Carrie was about to slip away and invest her emotional energy into other men. Carrie served as an energetic supply for Mr. Big, and although he felt suffocated at times, he had this urge to just always come back to her. He still found himself missing Carrie when she wasn't around, investing all of her emotions into him. And that is exactly how Carrie had a hold on Mr. Big without knowing it herself. That is why she was also always confused. So in a nutshell, the avoidant dismissive is just as emotionally deprived as the anxiously attached is, but the only difference is that the latter actively works to remediate this by seeking closeness and intimacy, while the dismissive avoidant does it by pushing people away, subconsciously testing them, and enhancing their own value by making themselves inaccessible. If you think about it, many couples in our beloved films and TV shows share those dysfunctional relational patterns, and the viewers eat it up because it is entertaining. And Hollywood knows that drama-filled relationships on screen sell more than healthy, stable ones. I really hope that this little case study summed up the relationship dynamic between the anxious and avoidant individuals perfectly. Thank you so much for listening.